Chapter 11 in histology deals with the anatomy of the female reproductive system. Our first slide illustrates schematically the structural components of this system. Certainly our story begins with the anatomy of the ovary, which is situated in close proximity to, but is not continuous with, a duct system that begins with the fimbria and the infundibulum of the uterine tube. The most clinically significant part and the longest part of the uterine tube is the ampulla that you see on this slide is interposed between the infundibulum and the isthmus. The isthmus then enters the uterus at the juncture between the fundus of the uterus, which is the rounded portion above the entrance of the tube, and the body of the uterus below. And then lastly, there's considered to be an intramural portion of the tube before it opens into the uterine lumen. The uterus itself, as we said, consists of a fundus and a body that are separated at the entry point of the uterine tube. And then the body ends at what's known as the internal os, which marks the beginning of the uterine cervix. The cervix ends at the external opening, or os, where the external os becomes continuous with the lumen of the vagina below. The next slide illustrates the various stages of follicular development that occur prior to ovulation. Recognize that virtually the entire population of follicles in an ovary consists of primary oocytes that are arrested in the prophase stage of meiosis I, because in females, gametogenesis begins in utero, and by the time birth is reached, all of the follicles are arrested in that prophase stage. So a primordial follicle, as we'll see, will be lined by a single layer of squamous granulosa cells. Primary follicle will be lined by a more cuboidal array, and the developing follicles will be progressively lined by a more stratified epithelium consisting of granulosa cells. Once a developing follicle acquires a cavity, it forms basically a secondary follicle that then matures to form a Graafian follicle. By the time an ovum basically is found inside a Graafian follicle, it has completed meiosis I, extruded a polar body, and just prior to ovulation, it has begun meiosis II as a secondary oocyte. The secondary oocyte becomes then arrested in the metaphase stage of meiosis II, and that what is ovulated, as you see in the bottom right of the picture. The ovulated ovum then briefly passes through the peritoneal cavity before it passes, hopefully, into the opening of the uterine tube at the level of the infundibulum. The resultant granulosa cells that persist after ovulation form the corpus luteum. Here's a more detailed picture of the anatomy of the secondary follicle that's at the Graafian follicle stage. We're looking at presumably an oocyte that has completed meiosis I and is now in the arrested stage of metaphase that is part of meiosis II. It is surrounded by the corona radiata, which is a stratified layer of granulosa cells that are continuous with a similar layer of granulosa cells that surround the follicular antrum. Outside the follicular antrum, we see an additional layer of cells that form the theca interna cells. In a histologic section, we can now visualize the difference between primordial and primary follicles. There are several small primordial follicles, a number of them situated at the top of the histologic section, each of these primary oocytes being surrounded by a single layer of squamous, what will become granulosa cells. The primary follicles basically are characterized by a slightly enlarged primary oocyte that's surrounded by one or more layers of more cuboidal granulosa cells. And over on the far right, you see the beginnings of an eosinophilic staining component, which will form the zona pellucida. The next slide shows a secondary follicle. We see the primary oocyte still surrounded by its glycoprotein coat forming the zona pellucida, that's at the arrowhead. And now we see the corona radiata surrounding the zona pellucida, forming by a stratified layer of granulosa cells that are continuous with the remaining granulosa cells that lie on the perimeter of the secondary follicle. And then, indicated by letter T, are the theca interna cells that lie outside the granulosa cells.